What is up guys, Morton here from SteamFirst.com with a review for Anomaly Defenders, a tower defense game developed by 11-Bit Studios and released May 29, 2014 on Steam for $10. When people think about tower defenses, one of two things will generally come to mind. Either user-made custom games on StarCraft or Warcraft 3, or Flash games from the early to mid-2000s, and depending on what you think about, your opinion of the genre will vary. For the most part, the Flash games are incredibly dumbed down and require no real thought or effort and are generally very boring, while the Warcraft 3 and StarCraft maps are a lot more in-depth and interesting. So which category is Anomaly Defenders in? Honestly, it's kind of in the middle. It's certainly more complex than Flash games, but it's severely lacking in some other departments. For those who don't know, tower defenses basically work in the following way. Enemies spawn from a given point and walk a specific path towards a goal, and you build towers along the path to kill the enemies before they get to whatever their goal is. As far as Anomaly Defenders goes, this is done quite well. The levels are all varied nicely and have multiple spawn points and paths to the end, and you can somewhat control the path the enemies take. One key difference between this game and other tower defenses is that in most TDs you have a set number of lives, and every time an enemy gets to the end of its path, you lose one life, but in Anomaly Defenders, the enemies are getting to a launchpad and trying to kill it. But the launchpad itself has an electric field that does a significant amount of damage to enemies passively, so it's actually kind of hard to lose, because even if you leak a couple enemies, they'll just die to the electric field, especially if you get them low on health first. Another interesting mechanic is that after each level, you get technology points to buy upgrades, which includes things like other towers, which you basically always buy as soon as possible, but also other things like increased critical strike chance, different abilities your towers can use, things like that. It's fun and you can reset your points whenever to try different abilities and tech routes, so there's a bit of customization. As for the towers, as I said, you unlock most of them through the tech trees, and that's fine in theory, but most of them have a level requirement. For example, one tower you can't unlock until level 19, and there are only 24 levels, so that's kind of a downer. There's 8 towers in total, and they're fairly different. You have a quick attacking short range tower, a slower attacking tower with heavy splash damage but it can't attack area units, things like that. But some of the towers are just useless. One tower in particular is supposed to deal heavy damage to shielded units, but the tower dies so incredibly fast that unless you want to sit there throwing energy into repairing the tower over and over, it's not worth it. And there are other towers that do basically the same amount of damage. There are different armor types, so some towers will do more damage to shielded units or armored units, but honestly, you can basically build the tower you start with, upgrade it a few times, and it will get you through almost every level because it can hit area units and it does a lot of damage. There are times when other towers are better, but they never really feel necessary until the very end. I mentioned repairing your towers with energy earlier, so let me expand on that. Energy is dropped from enemies when you kill them, and then you can use that energy for different abilities your tower has, such as repairing them or making them deal more damage or have a longer range. It's actually a fun mechanic because the energy spheres the enemy drop only last for a limited time, so you have to be constantly clicking them while also repairing towers, building new ones, and also timing your abilities properly. There's one last thing I need to mention about the gameplay, and this may seem like a small complaint, but it's actually the biggest issue I have with the entire game. You can only place or upgrade one tower at a time. What I mean is if you have say 4 level 1 towers, and you want to upgrade them all to level 2, you need to do each one individually. This is a massive problem in the later levels when you need to constantly repair and also build and upgrade towers. I found myself ending levels with over 10,000 gold on multiple occasions because it's impossible to spend it quickly having to make each tower individually. So you're constantly clicking on towers to upgrade them while also clicking on energy spheres, and then there are no hotkeys, so you need to click on the abilities you want to use. Regardless though, the gameplay is still pretty fun, and it can get pretty chaotic, perhaps even more chaotic because of all the clicking. It's somewhat complex, but there's definitely room for improvement in a couple of areas. Making the other towers more important to build, for example, or adding new ones, along with allowing you to upgrade multiple towers at a time, would all be massive improvements. Gameplay gets a 3.5 out of 5. It's certainly interesting, and there's a lot there, especially with the technology points, but there are still a lot of things that could be better without that much more work. As far as the graphics, the game looks pretty good. It's easy to differentiate between all your towers, and it's also easy to see what enemies are coming. It's futuristic looking and fits with the theme of the game well. The level design is great, and most of the levels look different. Some of them have similar backgrounds but different layouts, but a lot of them have entirely different backgrounds and color schemes. Graphics get a 4.5 out of 5. The only complaint is some of the earlier stages do get kind of samey, but after the first few levels it improves a lot. The audio is also good, with the voice acting getting special mention. The only voice in the game is a robotic woman who basically just reads the helpful text that appears when new towers and enemies are introduced, but it sounds perfect for the character. Robotic but somewhat human, but also not completely generic. I don't know, maybe I'm thinking too much about it. Anyway, the sound gets a 4 out of 5. The other sounds are all okay, the soundtrack is very good, but the tower sounds all blend together into a loud indistinguishable mess because you have like 20 of the things, and it's pretty hard to hear anything else over it. There's not much to say for the story. It exists, sort of, Basically, the entire game takes place in a whole world created by the Anomaly series, but there's not much story in this game in particular. If you're heavily into the Anomaly universe, you might enjoy it, but if that's the case, you've probably already bought it. If you're like me and you've never played one of the previous games, you'll find the story in this game basically non-existent and meaningless. Story for this game gets a 1.5 out of 5. There's a quick cutscene in the beginning and one after the final level, but they're basically forgettable and serve no real purpose. There's a fair amount of replayability too, which is nice. There are 3 difficulty modes, easy, normal, and hard, so you can play through a second time on a higher difficulty if you want. There's also a score system, so you can try and get a high score with the ranking system. And with the tech trees, you can try out different skill builds to try and improve your score. Replayability gets a 4 out of 5. It might get redundant for some people to keep playing the same levels repeatedly, but you can vary them up with different tower builds and such, and there's some achievements to go for as well, so it's still fairly different every time. Overall, Anomaly Defenders is a fun, challenging tower defense that does a lot of things very well and only has a couple of flaws. The level variety is great and the design makes things interesting all the way through. There's a good difficulty curve between getting new towers, new enemy types, and the level layouts getting increasingly complex. Anomaly Defenders gets a 4 out of 5. If you're looking for a good tower defense with a decent level of complexity and a nice visual style, it's definitely worth looking into.